Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about another COVID item. Seems like they keep on coming. Today we're going to talk about Yellow Book, COVID-19 Yellow Book Audit Alert. So GAO has issued a little bit of a reminder about what we should be thinking about when we're doing Yellow Book audits and the impact of COVID. Now, this is a really interesting one because they first issued the alert on July 21st, and I loved the alert. And then they pulled the alert and they reissued it in August of 2020 with far less information, much less in scope than what they had in the July version. Because they pulled the July version, I am going to talk about the August version, but if you're one of the lucky ones that got a chance to see the July version, I really liked it. And I was kind of bummed to see the amount of effort that they went through only to take almost all of the information out there. So definitely a little bit of a bummer here, but the goal is obviously to highlight some consideration and reminders given the COVID pandemic and to provide non-authoritative guidance. None of this amends Yellow Book. This doesn't replace Yellow Book. It's just trying to give us some focus. So auditors may need to focus their attention on certain areas. So audit risk may need to change due to the pandemic, fraud risk, internal controls, evidence, and quality control. So when we're looking through these areas, these are some of the focuses that they have. Now, they had a whole section on professional judgment in the last version that was pulled, but I would say that that's a really important element of this as well. So when we think about this, the circumstances related to the pandemic can actually increase audit risk, right? It can increase the inherent risk. It can have issues with the control risk. And so when we're working under these tight timeframes and they're very difficult programs, they're new programs, we don't know very much about them, that comes into play. And the size. For some entities, this might be their first Yellow Book audit or their first single audit because they've never gotten this much federal funding before. So as a result, we have to consider that in practice. And so when we think about the audit entity systems and processes for preventing and detecting inconsistencies, significant errors, or fraud, that now has to come into consideration for our audit risk. And so this is going to require us to think about audit risk a little bit differently and ask ourselves, what do we need to do differently under COVID? Where can there be increased risk that we might not have thought about before? And so when we think about fraud, the audit risk, it says ensure a scope of work is sufficient to address the audit objectives. So when we're doing our Yellow Book audits, right, they're financial reporting related. So are we incorporating inherent risk changes related to COVID, right? So work from home, how is that going to impact some of the items here when we're getting increased funding potentially? Adding specialists or other resources if we need them in this scenario. We might not have before, but now under COVID, it becomes more important. Changing our methodology to obtain alternative forms of corroborating evidence, right? So maybe you're having to do a remote inventory. Maybe you're having to do a remote internal control observation, right? So the methods that we're using may be changing under the standard. And then aligning the findings and conclusion to reflect the evidence. So we're not just business as usual. COVID is having an impact. And obviously, when we're doing our risk assessment, fraud risk, right, when we think about the fraud triangle, there can be some issues here as well, right? So new and expanded programs can increase the risk of potential fraud. One, all this money is coming super quickly, very hard to sort of track when we're thinking about donations of PPE and things that are coming into these organizations receiving funding, right? We're going to see an increase here in terms of opportunity, in terms of incentive, right? So there could be pressures to commit fraud due to the economic conditions threatening the entity's stability, right? If they don't, they're not going to be able to make it through this. We see a lot of nonprofits who are struggling because they can't open, they can't operate at full capacity. Opportunity due to the large number of payments or high value dollars being dispersed with no real controls in place, right? We're not expecting this money. It's going through a different process. We're working from home, so the controls that ordinarily would be in place are not in these scenarios. And then obviously, given the circumstances, rationalization is pretty easy, given that, it's a short-term thing. We're going to pay it back. It's only because we're doing this in order to be able to stay alive type of items. So when we're thinking about our processes and our steps that we're performing in our audit, right, look at the audit entity's most recent fraud risk assessment that they performed, see if they've revisited it since COVID-19. Look to see if there are any changes in controls, right, related to COVID-19. Have they thought about it? Okay, everyone's working from home, or we furloughed half our staff. What are we doing to maintain segregation of duties? mechanisms or indicators, if any, used to identify potential fraud with the response to the pandemic, and then identified attempts to defraud the program's response. And so all of these are things that we need to consider. So when we're looking at this control risk, a newer increased area. So when we think about audited entities, employees are working remotely, changes in staffing at the audited entity, such as those caused by furlough, all of those would come into play here. In terms of internal control, increased risk may be found for audited entities and programs created in response. So again, when we think about this, so they might not have the same systems that they had historically, and it might not be as well documented. So what is that going to look like? So some questions that auditors can ask: has the audited entity recently created a new program or process to use or disperse government funds? Have they updated their systems of internal controls for the new laws and regulations as part of their response? If anyone's been furloughed, how are they maintaining that level of internal control for segregation of duties? Are there any additional pressures on management that may affect the auditor's assessment of the audited entity's control environment? For example, did management not design or implement controls effectively, or did they override existing internal controls to get something done quickly? Has the auditor become aware of waste or abuse, or were controls operating effectively throughout the period given the pressures? So these are some of the questions we need to ask. We know that audit evidence might look differently if people are working from home, right? We might not have a wet signature. We might have a visual instead. And so when we think about our audit evidence, right, we might have challenges from difficulty accessing records, right? So if something is in physical format and you can't go to the office, right? So how are we going to do that? Difficulty observing inventory or property, right? How does a remote observation look? Restrictions on travel. I, typically travel 135 flights a year, and I haven't been on an airplane since February. So, this is definitely a different world for me. And then limited ability to access sensitive or classified data. So I think that's another one where if, this is really private information, you can't take it home with you. So what is that going to look like? So we might have to change our methodology to overcome these and still maintain the requirements of Yellow Book. So things that we might want to consider, the audit organizations are required to establish policies and procedures for the continuance of engagements that are designed to provide reasonable assurance. So we still need to get sufficient appropriate evidence. So the procedures, we might have to delay the audit until we can physically be present. We might have to terminate the audit. We might have to change the methodology in order to be able to get sufficient appropriate evidence. You can't do a bad audit simply because of COVID. You still have to meet all of the standards. You just have to be a little bit more creative. And then obviously quality control, major area here, are the audit organization's system of quality control being updated, right? So how we're working from home, we're working remotely, those new programs that are existing, what are we going to be doing with them? So we need to make sure that we are updating our systems of quality control to be responsive to the changes in how we're doing audits, how we're supervising when people are not in the same building working together, how are we making sure we get evidence when we're doing it remotely. We still have to follow all the rules. And so our QC system has to kick in and help us achieve that. So that is the audit alert. At the end of the alert, they do give some references to other material that's out there. So if you're looking for more, there's lots of information out there on how to do a remote audit. This was just a little exercise done by Yellow Book to remind us that we still have to do a great audit. We still have to comply with all the rules and regulations, just have to consider how the pandemic is impacting us, our clients, and the evidence that we need to have reasonable assurance. So hopefully that was a great overview of what the changes are in here. Again, I think it was a little bit scaled back from its original version, but it's still helpful to just remind us that we need to be thinking differently during COVID when we're performing these audits. So thank you so much for joining me on the Genuine Learning blog. I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.